I'm going to go through and just mention now, we're going to focus on the part of what's happening in the WTO. And as we know, it's important when we're talking about development, anytime we're in UNCTAD, or actually anytime we're talking about trade, we should be talking about development. And there was, since 1995, a development agenda in the WTO. So I'd like to first point that out because it's what developing countries have been advocating for well over 20 years now, is a development agenda. As we know, in the WTO since 1998, there's a mandate for discussions on e-commerce. And I just want to point that out because we all know the difference between discussions and negotiations. It's like the difference between dating and talking about getting married. It's quite a big difference, that shift. So in 2016, as many of you must be aware, the US and other countries started tabling proposals on the idea of negotiating e-commerce. At December 2017 ministerial in Buenos Aires, for those who might not be aware, the vast majority of developing countries successfully blocked the launch of new negotiations on e-commerce, and only about 25 developing countries, obviously it was signed by 76 countries, we know that, but 25 developing countries were in favor of starting negotiations. But the mandate in the WTO is actually not to have them, to have negotiations. And so in January at the World Economic Forum, about less than half of WTO members agreed to, published a statement saying that they wanted to start negotiations, even though that's against the mandate of the institution, and then they started those in March. So, you know, just to frame a little bit the discussion on tax, you know, many of the global tax problems that were just mentioned by Monica here come about because of trade misinvoicing. So you know, people often say, well, they're not cheating on their taxes, they're using legal loopholes. But the big corporations that are doing this tax evasion, tax avoidance, are really using loopholes in the system that need to be closed, and that's why there's been this big international effort that Monica just described in detail to close that. So that really should be something that should be on the table when we talk about development, for the reasons that Sylvester talked about, the importance of tax revenue for Africa, and for what Danny talked about, the importance of tax revenue for public services for people around the world to have a functioning state. But there hasn't really been a discussion on that. And to my knowledge, there has not been a lot of discussion on the tax implications of the new proposals on e-commerce in the WTO. There is also something I should mention, which is that since 1996, WTO members agreed on a moratorium on border taxes, customs taxes on electronic transmissions. And that refers to things like digital movies, digital music, when you just, you know, somebody sends you a photo from another country. So that has been rolled over every 2 years. And it's important to note that it's a demand of some developed countries. And what happens, the dynamic in the WTO, is that there's another waiver that is advocated for by developing countries. And that's a waiver for them not to be prosecuted in a WTO case by another member who feels that the benefits that they intended to get from a WTO TRIPS agreement were violated. So even if say India is one of the proponents, even if India didn't violate the rules, there's the maybe potential that another country like the United States could say, well, you violated the benefits I intended to get from the agreement, even if you didn't violate the rules. So there has to be a specific waiver to say that no, even if countries didn't violate the rules, you can't prosecute them in a case. You can't take them to WTO dispute settlement if they haven't actually violated the rules. So this is traded, and what that means is that Netflix not paying taxes is traded for access to medicines. Okay, so that's really important for people to know. And that's been renewed every 2 years, and it was very controversial at the last WTO ministerial. And at the last WTO ministerial, there was rumors and demands actually from developed countries to try to make the electronic transmissions waiver permanent, which is kind of crazy given the presentation that Rashmi will give. And the electronic transmissions waiver is often included in new bilateral or regional trade agreements, and that's something to also consider, that a lot of developing countries are being pressured to include these, even if they've been rejected in the WTO. Next slide, please. So we're all familiar with this. I think everybody saw it. Amazon, one of the largest corporations in the world. As you know, now 5 of the 6 largest corporations in the entire world are US-based big tech companies. And Amazon, one of the biggest, figured out how to pay nothing on, no federal taxes on $11.2 billion in profits. And this is the graph. This is from the Washington Post, which it must be noted is owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon. Okay, so this is really incredible that this came out here. And the story talks about how they actually were able to do this through using a variety of loopholes, and they actually got a federal tax rebate. So it's not that they paid zero, they actually got money back from the government after using the public services, the skills development, the infrastructure, the postal system, the electricity, everything else that they shared using, next slide please. Yeah, so that is the quote from the article. Next. So in order to talk about tax, I just want to situate it in what are the goals of big tech in the e-commerce negotiations in general. And it's actually why we refer to the negotiations as being about digital trade or the digital economy, because it goes far beyond just people buying stuff online. And I think e-commerce might have been an appropriate word way back when they first started discussions on this issue in 1998, but it's really not anymore because of the way that digitalization has really permeated so many aspects of the global economy. So if we look at the proposals, you can look at them provision by provision and get very lost in the technical details. But one way to look at it is that this is what big business wants to get out of rewriting the rules of the global economy so that they can make more profit. That's what, in the easiest sense to understand, they are. So what are their goals? And this is according to the submissions that corporations and their lobbying organizations have made to the U.S. Trade Representative who came up with the first proposals on these. They want rights to access to markets, right? So they want to be able to operate in markets around the world without being restricted or having countries, be able to put up barriers that would protect their domestic industries. They want to lock in deregulation. Deregulation is inherent in the business model of a lot of these companies. So if you think about something like Uber or Airbnb, these corporations, which have still not turned a profit, operate because they don't abide by the regulations of the districts in which they're making money, okay? So they have been chronic lawbreakers since their inception, and there are multiple cases against them moving through the courts. Right now we have one for Facebook for allowing super discriminatory practices that were outlawed and, go back to the 1950s about not allowing African Americans in our country, I'm from the United States, to be able to get mortgage loans. Facebook is allowing that type of practice to happen in its Airbnb targeting for its advertising, which is, of course, its source of revenue. So locking in deregulation is a major part of their business model. Access to cheap labor stripped of its rights, tax avoidance and evasion, and the new one, because all of these things are similar to many other corporations, is control of big data. So getting back to the tax issue, this is just a very illustrative, diagram that you can see, and this appeared in Forbes magazine, another leftist rag, that's explaining the kind of things that we talk about, how a company like Uber is able to use tax shifting, tax avoidance, the base erosion that Monica talked about in order to basically ensure that it doesn't owe any income taxes in the countries in which it operates. Next slide. So let's now talk about what are the rules. Why are we concerned about the proposed digital trade rules and what tax implications are there, okay? So there are at least 7 ways that that transnational corporations are seeking to use trade agreements, and here the WTO's e-commerce, to lock down a regime in which they will not be accountable to the countries in which they profit to pay taxes. So the first one is by making permanent the waiver on electronic transmissions. And Rashmi, who's going to speak after me, is a huge expert on this subject and is going to explain why losses to developing countries are 40 times the projected losses to developed countries. So this is a very big issue for developing countries and not so for developed that are not dependent on electronic transmission, on tax revenues on many of these digitizable products. The second one, that's another straightforward tariff issue, is that they want to have a high minimum for tariff-free small packages. So for anyone who's not familiar with de minimis, it means basically that the products, that the potential revenue, tariff revenue that a country would gain by assessing tariffs on the product is actually too costly administratively for the country to actually go through the process. So the World Customs Organization has explained that this is it's just supposed to be an economic exercise that every country does for itself. It's different depending on the country, and you just, look at your costs of assessing revenue, and you say what is the point at which it doesn't make sense for me to go after, what might result in a $5 tariff if it costs me $20 in administrative costs to assess that. And this is something that the U.S. proposal is to raise it to a quote-unquote reasonable level. So we would argue that they are at reasonable levels because that's the international agreement from another institution that's been set for a long time. But the U.S. is an outlier. It's extremely high because we have a different system of assessing taxes. This was explained to us by Anna Hinojosa of the World Customs Organization, and the U.S. is $800. So many other countries have $5, have $20. This would mean that almost all small packages could come in without any kind of tax assessment. The third one that's specifically a tariff issue is that there have been proposals to remove tariffs on information technology products by encouraging countries to join the Information Technology Agreement. And this is an agreement that had its first iteration many years ago and was expanded a few years ago with more countries and more products, more scope and coverage, to say that information technologies should, for some reason, not have taxes assessed on them, so that the companies that are that would have to pay those tariffs basically can do that without contributing to the tax base of the country. And this is very reflective of what Danny Bertosa mentioned, that those interests that have the biggest lobbies are those that are able to reduce taxes, because we're talking about big tech then being able to reduce taxes on its products. Those three are fairly straightforward tariff issues, and you can see that if you imposed all of them at the same time, you would really reduce the tariff revenue of the country. The next few I'm going to talk about are a little bit different. They have to do with just the corporate income of proposals to reduce corporate income. And one of the proposals we know we've heard about quite a bit is that the big tech companies, and actually most transnational companies, would like to ban developing countries from being able to require technology transfer. And we know, next slide please, that increasingly companies, developed country corporations are using intellectual property rights to book profits in low tax regimes.